is this thing on the questions around immigration, and I'm being very specific with going with why or why not. It precludes the sort of what you expect in response when you ask why or why not, and that is a cause and effect question. Why or why not is you'll respond because blank. And so in doing so, when we're going to talk about immigration, we're actually going to go as far back as possible as a cause and effect based question. You want to predate as much as possible. And so in the context of human development, this is where sort of how the human species developed. This is where you can address policy questions around immigration, but it's more important to understand how the human species developed before you get into cultural questions or economic questions. So, how did the human species develop? Well, we don't know a lot about pre-societal humanity, primarily because they lived in hunter-gatherer tribes and survival was paramount. Survival against the elements, survival against natural predators, and against each other. And these hunter-gatherer tribes, most of the day-to-day was finding food. That was a task. Staying alive, finding food, and then eventually, potentially, having a sexual encounter and producing children. That was pre-societal humanity. Hunter-gatherer tribes, hunting food, sharing food, and having children. What allowed for societies to develop was the domestication of animals. What that meant was less energy spent on hunting and more energy devoted to forming communities, whether it be growing food or actually raising domesticated animals. It was the domestication of animals that led to societies and civilizations as we know it. And what this did was allowed for more forms of employment to enter into the growing ecosystem of people. This allowed for the concept to the state to develop, which allowed for things like performative arts, things like written arts, and things like fine arts. And these written arts, performative arts, they allowed cultures and societies to share information, to pass down belief systems, pass down myths, pass down stories. And thus, with societal, it wasn't necessarily that everyone was in the production of food and survival mechanisms. And it allowed also for people to gain power within these social communities because they weren't just traveling around all the time trying to scour for food. So with societal humanity, it was still majority self-employed. It was still mostly farmers, herders, and then merchants who would commune and help sell. And this basically ran the main economic systems, whether there were different political systems in terms of like monarchy, feudalism, stuff like that. This ran from antiquity to about the late 18th century. beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And there was what we called cottage industries prior to the Industrial Revolution, where families were the primary economic systems, and they would trade with one another and then trade sort of cross-culturally. And then with the Industrial Revolution came the factories, came mines. Factories and mines changed how employment worked. Instead of sort of just family farms and what have you, sort of the largest business, you would probably see maybe 20, 30 employees. With industrialization, needing infrastructure for getting those energy resources, but also the mining and the factories to mass produce things. What ended up happening was people would urbanize, move into cities. And this has changed the nature of employment in that it wasn't, fewer and fewer people were self-employed. Fewer and fewer people were basically responsible for whatever output they produced and then sold it. What ended up happening was they went to work for employers and became wage workers. And this led to very different power dynamics within employment. Things like robber barons and land ownership and different factors. And this period also saw a decline in women's economic opportunities. See, during the antiquity and medieval period, women were involved in those industries because basically everyone was self-employed. Once corporations became a thing to help mass produce, women were no longer largely employed, and it was a lot tied to who they would marry. And so what ended up happening in countries that were successful in industrializing is eventually there was liberation movements for women. First, the political, trying to get the right to vote. Then the economic, trying to get involved in the labor force. And then towards the end was the sexual, meaning control over reproductive choices, and also sort of liberation within divorce law. And ever since those movements were successful, we have seen a decline in birth rates pretty much all across the world. So once birth control, access to reproductive tools became a thing, birth rates pretty much all across the world, regardless of economy, regardless of culture. The only countries that still have generally high birth rates and somewhat increasing birth rates are places that did not experience strong enough women's liberation movements, particularly in the Middle East, Northern Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and then countries that have not strong enough economies to gain birth control resources, like Latin America. So, like within Latin America. So, what ended up happening is countries that don't have high enough birth rates use immigration to maintain a workforce, because that workforce needs to be there as people retire and need social services from the state. So immigration is a tool to help maintain a workforce, but the problem is that if you bring it in too quickly, it can lead to cultural clashes, and it could also lead to housing market issues, because if you're bringing in too many people for the amount of homes you're building, it'll make it difficult to succeed in seeking home ownership. So when you want to ask the question, immigration, why or why not, you have to ask the question, do you have the resources to integrate cultures, and do you have the resources to bring in people without causing major grievances to different socioeconomic groups trying to seek equity within the economic system? And that fundamentally is what the immigration why or why not thing is. And the biggest risk with sort of the reactionary conservatism is they want to both restrict immigration and then sort of peel back women's liberation in order to reestablish birth rates of a previous generation. But the thing is that they're not realizing that the reason the women's liberation began in the first place was because of the nature of employment. So you have to change the nature of employment, otherwise you're going to have more social disunity. So reactionary conservatism does not address it, and thus will not be able to reinstate those birth rates regardless of if they are successful in peeling back women's liberation, peeling back immigration. So the why or why not? If you're a country that needs to develop its workforce, needs to bring in more people for energy development, agricultural development, and as long as it does not impede on what housing resources you have, then yes, immigration is a good potential tool. But it's not going to be effective if you do it too quickly. So there has to be strategy around it. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next one.